Bailey Foley was always the hammer, never the nail. That's how he played football. But when he suffered a life-altering injury, it caused not only his teammates and coaches at Fortuna High School, but an entire community on the northern coast of California to re-examine their views on America's beloved game. Ultimately, most everyone involved decided to press onward with the vow to not only play for their fallen teammate, but to play like him. The result was the school's first state championship. Tim Keown chronicled the saga in a story titled The Fearless Bailey Foley in the August 20th issue of ESPN the magazine. It's a beautiful, complicated, heart-wrenching tale that wrestles with the dilemma of how one deals with the aftermath when something terrible turns into something wonderful. Here's my conversation with Tim Keown. Thanks for joining me, Tim. First off, what kind of kid was Bailey Foley, and what kind of player was he?
Well, as a kid, Bailey was he was a little rough around the edges, to be honest. He will admit that he was not a very good student. He didn't really care about school. He did the bare minimum, and that was kind of when he did that, because there were times when he didn't do the bare minimum. He had to take 10 units of summer school just to be eligible to play football his senior year. He was a tough kid. He was a as I write in the piece, he kind of lived outside, which is kind of unusual in this day and age. He was a fisherman, and he rode dirt bikes, and he lived, along the coast there in Humboldt County is where he lives, and there's a lot of opportunity to be outside. There's the ocean, there's the Eel River, there's all kinds of stuff to do, and he took advantage of that. And to be honest, he would have rather been out on his dirt bike than sitting in a classroom. So that's kind of the kid he was. And I think that he was as a football player, he sort of exemplified the same characteristics. He was tough. He was a little undersized for a defensive end, 160 to 180 pounds. Just as his coach, Mike Benbow, told me, he just blew things up. He wasn't much for assignment football, but if you told him who to hit, he definitely did that.
Yeah, it was interesting, that quote about him putting an undersized player at defensive end because the not being an assignment football guy, which reminded me, obviously he's not the same kind of player, but it reminded me of, it's almost the exact kind of description of how Junior Seau played. Yes,
and I think there was obviously physical characteristics that separated those two, but yeah, there was sort of a one of his teammates. I mean, I can't even count the number of quotes these kids gave me that were just remarkable, in terms of their insight. And it's a common football thing to say it's better to be the hammer than the nail, and that was their description of Bailey, was that he was always the hammer and never the nail. And I think that's one thing that I don't know why, but it seemed to really perplex these kids that someone who was the hammer ended up getting hurt. They feel like you get hit and get hurt in football. You don't do the hitting. And I think there's a interesting little bumper sticker that's on the podium of Mike Benbow's classroom in Fortuna. He teaches AP history, and there's a little sticker that says "hit or be hit," and I think that's sort of this ethic in football that we tend to think that someone like Junior Seau or Bailey Foley, who was always hitting someone, they were exempt from injury. It's a strange mentality, but it's something that probably needs to change.
Now, another thing that's really interesting about Bailey's story in particular that kind of makes it unique is that, and you actually begin your story with this anecdote, is that they could not find a hit on film that caused his injury. And so how confident are they that the injury came because of football?
Well, I think, I think it's sort of the most obvious explanation. It's sort of like, Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is probably the correct one most of the time. I think that he did there were plays in that game. I watched the whole game with the coach Mike Benbow, and there were plays where Bailey did have hits. They just weren't. They were nothing that stopped you. There was nothing that where you said, "Oh my gosh," like you would normally think to produce this kind of brain trauma. There just wasn't any specific hit. And, the doctors I spoke to said it could have happened the week before. It could have been accumulation of hits. As we've learned with the research into CTE, that's another factor, is that the accumulation of concussive hits, even small hits, is that, when they put the sensors in the helmets, they can figure that it's not always just one traumatic event, that small events can lead up to a traumatic event. And it was very frustrating and very, upsetting for everyone involved, because there was a thought that it would have been easier if they would have said, okay, boom, there's where it happened. See that hit right there? We should have seen that. But there was never a time when he got off of a pile wobbly. There was never a time where he appeared to be confused. And so they just continued to search, and they never found it. So they just basically had to say, we can't pinpoint it, but it's pretty clear that it happened during a football game and that football had something to do with it.
And the coach, Mike Benbow, has dealt with tremendous guilt since that happened, as has his best friend, Ethan Higgins, who convinced him to go to summer school so that he would be eligible for a football season, right? Seems like guilt has been one of the major issue that everyone involved has been dealing with in this story.
Very true, Bob. And I think that the interesting thing is that Bailey doesn't blame anyone. He doesn't say, the coach should have seen this, or, obviously he can't remember what happened. He has no recollection of anything probably for about 4 months after the event. But he doesn't blame anyone. His parents don't blame anyone. It's kind of interesting, because there's no, there's, you would normally feel that would be an obvious thing, is to say, hey, why didn't you see this? Obviously my kid ended up, having to have brain surgery, and he had this bleed, and why didn't you see it beforehand? But there's nothing there. The guilt is with, in a even though Bailey did not die, it's sort of a survivor's guilt feeling, is that Ethan was someone who said, hey, we need you on the football team, and he encouraged him to go to summer school. So there's obvious guilt there, that he feels like, okay, if I just let him do what he wanted to do, he would never be in this situation. Benbow's feeling is, I'm the coach, they're my boys, they're under my watch, I should have seen something. And yet there was nothing to see. As he said, supposedly it would be easier if he could have pinpointed some event, but how would that have been easier? Would it have been easier? Would it have been even maybe harder, because then it would have been something that he would have felt even more guilt, because he would have actually missed something. And he really feels like he didn't miss anything, that this just was a fluke event.
Yeah. Let's talk about the sort of the struggle everyone went through, the coaches, the players, deciding whether or not to continue after Bailey was hurt. Like they thought they were going to witness one of their players die. And even though he didn't, it was still very much a struggle for them. What was that like?
Well, it changed everything with them, Bob. And the next day they met at one of the players' houses and had this conversation about whether they wanted to continue. And this was at a time when, probably 14 hours after Bailey was taken to the hospital, they felt that there was no guarantee that Bailey was going to survive. They still felt like they may have witnessed their teammate die on the sideline. So it wasn't like they were looking at it as, okay, wow, that was close. They were unsure what was going to happen. There was still this tremendous uncertainty surrounding the team. And so they had this meeting about whether to continue. And the coaches left it up to the players, and they wanted to just gauge what their reaction was, and they prefaced everything by saying, look, if you guys want to stop playing, any one of you individually or as a group, there will be no repercussions. We're not going to make fun of you. And they vowed that if anyone stopped playing, they would never use the word quit. They would never call the person a quitter. They would never say they quit. They would just say that they stopped playing or decided to stop. And, in the course of this conversation, they, as teenage boys will, they tried to rationalize it. Of course, they wanted to keep playing. They had a really good team. And so they said, Bailey would want us to keep playing. That's a very common sort of, reason to keep going is to...
I apologize for the bad audio here. What Tim is saying is that the kids decided to play for Bailey, and then team captain J.B. Lewis said, if we're going to play for Bailey, we need to play like Bailey.
And that was yet another sort of very, in my mind, very poignant and profound moment in this saga was that idea that, we can't just keep playing for him. We need to play like him. And, yeah, so I think that was sort of the mantra the rest of the way.
And playing like Bailey, that meant, correct me if I'm wrong, basically sacrificing yourself for the game and for your team and for the season? It
did. It meant playing as hard as you can every play. That's kind of that was the idea was, this kid had a spirit on the field and a desire once he got out there that we need to put forth that kind of effort and that kind of attitude to go forward.
It's funny because that, in a way, that is the most effective way to play football, it seems like, and yet also the way that really you put yourself in the hands of good fortune, and it's quite the dilemma, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's pretty much everything about this story and everything about football is that there are just so many counterintuitive things. I mean, the best way to play is to play all out and play. Kids, when you start playing football, they tell you that you get hurt when you don't go hard, and whether that's a motivational technique or an actual scientific fact, I think we can probably say it's more motivational than anything. Mm-hmm. But it's this sort of, in this reconsideration of football that we're going through when we see what the game does to the body and to the brain. It's one of those things that it's a contradiction in terms, that we're going to play the way this guy played who almost lost his life because of the game. And yet that's what that mentality is a good football mentality, to win games and to play on the field. And yet it is also something that leads to injuries.
When you talk about this dilemma, two coaches, it's a risk reward situation. What do coaches tell you about why they continue in the face of so much growing evidence about the long-term effects? Like, what are the qualities that make it worth it to them?
This story brought out so much in terms of both sides of this entire debate. I mean, it just was almost like exaggerated on both ends, what happened to Bailey and also what happened to this team. They ended up bringing a state championship to this little town up on the North Coast that never had anything resembling that kind of success in football. And it taught them, according to the coaches, what that season did was it brought these kids together. It taught them life lessons. It taught them to play for the person next to them. It taught them to stay together. Bailey's injury brought them. It sent them, after practice, sitting in the parking lot talking about life and death and their own mortality and vulnerabilities and all these things that 17, 18-year-old boys would never discuss without this sort of unfortunate, tragic event taking place right in front of them. And so as they were walking off the field after they won the state championship, Benbow told me he was looking at these kids and thinking just how fantastic it was and how all these lessons that he holds so dear, and the reasons that he keeps coaching high school football and feels it's the best sport and it's a great learning experience, and all these other sort of, traditional football things that we've come to sort of almost accept in our culture, is that he was looking and thinking, something terrible happened and yet something great came out of it. And that's again this whole push pull of the game, is that they keep coaching because of those moments, and yet that moment might not have been possible without the terrible moment that started their season. So yeah, I think the only way you can keep going is if you just say, hey, kids can get hurt in any other way. There's a car accident, or there's, something else, that we're all vulnerable. You can get hurt in a million different ways, and this just happened to be the way that Bailey got hurt. But they definitely think about it. They definitely think about this back and forth of what they feel is wonderful about this game, and what we all see as being potentially terrible about it.
Do you think there's a way to make football safer while also keeping some of these qualities that make it the sport that it is?
Well, I've wondered that a million times, and I played football through high school. I have 4 sons that all played football in high school, and there were, as these studies and this research was becoming more prominent, obviously it became more of a topic in our household. And I played baseball, and my kids played other sports, and I don't know if it's a myth or not that football is this sport that brings us together more than any other. I think that you can have this, you can develop toughness and all these other qualities by playing baseball or by playing basketball. And I think that the reason that football has created this sort of mythology around it is the actions of coaches, like the Junction Boys with Bear Bryant and all this. I mean, going back that far, we've created this myth around football that it creates the toughest people, and it is a tougher sport to play. There are physically it is very difficult. As far as what the game is and whether it can be changed enough, I don't know that it can be changed enough to remain the same sport. I mean, it would almost have to be flag football or rugby, and I don't know. I don't know if that's the same sport. And look at the changes that have been made in the NFL with the rules with contact on receivers and quarterbacks, and it just, look at the backlash against that. It just is people feel like the game's being ruined because somebody can't lead with their head. So what's going to happen if the game gets changed to where you can't hit at all? I mean, it's not going to be the same game.
What do you think is this is, I know, a hard question to answer, but is there any indication of what life is going to be like going forward for Bailey, who, by the way, still watches football, right?
He does. He told me, you know what? You play football, sometimes you get hurt, and he just shrugs. I mean, this is a kid who spent 3 weeks in a coma and 4.5 months in a hospital, and that's his attitude. So, going forward, I think that he had made such great progress for the 6 months after he was out of the hospital, that their hope is that he will lead a normal life, and he'll be able to live independently, and get a job and do all the things that he had hoped to do. But it remains to be seen. There's not any guarantee of that. He still has vision issues. He has balance issues. He has clearly memory issues. His motor skills have gotten better, but they're not to a point where he could, at least the last time I saw him, where he could drive a car or even one of his motorcycles. So it's going to be a long road for Bailey, and I would think that there will always be some level of diminishment in his physical compared to what he could have done. I mean, the idea of him getting back to 100% physically seems like a long shot, but he's a tough kid. He's determined, and he's made great strides to this point. So who knows?
Is it even possible to come up with an underlying lesson to all of this, or is it just so complex it's hard to pinpoint?
There's so many lessons to this, Bob. I don't know how many.
Yeah.
I mean, you could use the case of Bailey Foley as a reason to ban football, and you could use the case of Bailey Foley as a reason to exalt football. It just is what makes this story so fascinating to me, is that there were no easy answers. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something that you could just come out and say, okay, boom, this happened to this kid. Why are we putting our kids through this? I mean, you can do that in the case of Bailey, but then you can look at the other 34 kids on that team that ended up winning a state championship and say the lessons and the life skills that they learned through this whole saga were incredibly valuable. At some point you say, okay, are we sacrificing this child for the betterment of this other group or for this game? Are we sacrificing them on the pyre of football? And I don't know. I mean, I think that personally, I think that the story of Bailey Foley, the lesson is that you never know. I mean, that things can happen that aren't obvious in football, and that adds a whole nother layer of fright, of fear to playing this game, is that it's not just avoiding some major hit. That there could be an accumulation. There could be something unseen. I mean, that to me is the lesson, is like, oh my gosh, it can happen when we don't see it.
Yeah. It's a complicated story, great story you wrote. And this issue is going to be an issue for a long time, I have a feeling. So
definitely.
Thank you so much for joining me, Tim.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bob. I appreciate it.
If you haven't already, go read The Fearless Bailey Foley on ESPN.com. It really is a must-read for anyone interested in this topic, and make sure you look for more of Tim Keown's writing in ESPN the magazine. I'm Bob Harkins. This is Raised Sports. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.